Okay.
Welcome everyone to the May membership meeting of the DC League of Women Voters. I'm Catherine Ray, a League trustee and editor of our Vote 411 online voter guides, along with my husband, Dennis. I'd like to take a moment to ask our president, Kathy Sharon, to just give us a wave. Also, special thanks to Vice President Lee Palmer for setting up the Zoom and getting the word out about the program. I see that we have Karen Hibden, our technology guru, and Sarah, our wonderful member who does most everything for us here. And today, the larger Anderson clan is very well represented. So with us, we have our statehood champion, Ann Anderson, and our vice president for membership, Sharon Anderson. And soon we'll have a speaker named Anderson. I can't see everyone on this call, so I invite other board members, past and present. I think maybe I see Sim and Emily. So give everybody a wave so we can acknowledge and thank you for all the work you've done for the League.
Yulin is on the call too.
Okay, we'll give a shout out and a wave to all of our people who
there you go.
Make this a viable organization, because we are 100% volunteer. So today our co-presenters will share their expertise and experience as we focus on DC's justice system. Casey Anderson is the policy analyst, development manager of the Council for Court Excellence. The mission of her organization is improving justice for the community. Christy Respress is the executive director of Pathways to Housing DC. The mission of her organization is ending homelessness through housing first. Both were active participants in the Council for Court Excellence recent study that we will be discussing today. The League interests and those of our presenters closely intersect. We share a larger interest in good governance in all arenas, including justice, but also specifically rights for returning citizens, sentencing reform, and of course, housing. If you have questions for our presenters, please pose them in the chat. Sharon Anderson will pose those questions at the end of the presentation. And now I'd like to turn our meeting over to Christy and to Casey. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm just going to get my screen share going. Can everybody see this?
Yep.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. We are excited to be with you all this afternoon. Christy and I are here because in February, the District Task Force on Jails and Justice published its Phase 2 report, Jails and Justice, Our Transformation Starts Today, an 80-point implementation plan to invest in safe communities and to lower DC's incarceration rate by half. It also proposes steps to regain local control of DC's criminal justice system, end the use of the federal prisons within 10 years, and to create one new non-traditional facility that would house all people still detained pre-trial or sentenced to incarceration for a DC crime, among other reforms. Like Catherine said, my name is Casey Anderson. The Council for Court Excellence helped facilitate the task force's work, and I specifically supported the Committee on Local Control and the Committee on Community Investments and Alternatives to the Criminal Justice System. I am joined today by Christy, who served as a member of the District Task Force on Jails and Justice.
Great, thank you, and thanks for welcoming us. As Casey said, that's exactly it. I was a real honor to serve. And I mainly worked with the committee on the community investment side and alternatives to the criminal justice system. I'm going to say a quick word about language. You might hear me intersperse or change the word criminal justice with criminal legal system through this, because our current system is anything but just for many people. So that language you might hear, I just want to explain that. And then today we are really going to give you an overview of the task force process, a little bit of a history in the overview about of the DC's current or past system of incarceration, and then really review the highlights from the task force's recommendations, So we're really excited to share this hour with you.
Thank you for that point on language there, Christy. The task force is a 26-member independent advisory body. It was founded in 2019 and was dedicated to redefining DC's approach to incarceration. It's focused on building citywide engagement, centering the voices of those with lived experiences, understanding community priorities, and community-based solutions. So like I said, there are 26 task force members, but there were dozens of advisors, including people who have been previously incarcerated, government decision makers, academics and policy leaders, practitioners, service providers, and advocates, among others. The task force's deliberations were guided by its core values of urgency, accountability, equity, and compassion. Recognizing that conversations about racism in the criminal justice system have long been silenced, the task force explicitly committed to anti-racism in its work. Where the information was available, all 80 recommendations in the Phase 2 implementation plan detail their potential impact on DC's Black population.
So as you can imagine, there was an incredible amount of research and information that went into developing the task force plan. This was not a simple or short process, as it shouldn't have been. So during Phase 1, the task force really engaged, we focused on community engagement and worked with almost 2,000 community members. We analyzed jail data, we learned from other jurisdictions. And then the first report, which is called a Framework for Change, was released in November of 2019. And that offered 17 high-level recommendations to guide the district's reform. So let us know if you want that. But in Phase 2, the task force engaged another 500 community members, continued the research, and made the recommendations actionable in the form of the implementation plan, Jails and Justice, Our Transformation Starts Today. So the new report offers now an 80-point plan, which makes the community safer for really all residents, all I emphasize, and overhauls the district's jails and justice system in 3 stages over the next 10 years, recognizing that this change is going to take some time, but we needed to put a timeline on it. It could not be open-ended. It's truly a roadmap for DC to implement specific changes to our budget, our laws, our policies, and to reduce our incarcerated population and improve the justice system in concrete and very measurable ways, with a specific focus on ending disproportionate negative impact on Black residents, as Casey just mentioned.
So let's talk about the history of our correction system and where we stand today. As both Christy and I have talked about, I'm sure you guys are also not shocked to hear that DC's jail and prison system is fundamentally rooted in racism and has been through several generations of reform. We've had 5 facilities of our own, plus the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and none of these correctional institutions have solved the problems of the ones that came before them. That's why the task force's focus went beyond the facility alone to change the reach of the whole system. So the first jail in 1838 was also called the slave pen because alleged runaways were held there. It housed about 200 people when it closed, and it was on the site of the current National Building Museum. Then in 1875, we have the old DC jail, and this jail moved to the current site on Reservation 13. It was crowded after 20 years, but it was used for 100. Eventually, a presidential commission was established that created Lorton to try to fix the overcrowding issue, but it still persisted. And then in 1972, in response to the overcrowding, there was a jail uprising that was modeled after Attica, took 12 hostages, but no one was killed. This ultimately grew into 2 major lawsuits and the construction of a new facility. So then we get to the facilities that we currently have. We have the CDF, Central Detention Facility, also usually referred to as the DC jail. It is an old model, so there's very little visibility and almost no room for programming space. The FY20 capital budget actually proposes for DOC to include more than $77 million for repairs, if that sort of gives you an idea on the sort of state of the facility. And then we also have the CTF, or Central Treatment Facility. and that is a minimum and medium security facility for special populations, such as women or people with disabilities. For about 20 years, it was privately controlled by CCA, or now called Core Civic, a private prison company from 1997 to 2017. It does have more programming space, and DOC is now using it in a bit more exciting ways. So folks who are sentenced under the DC code for a longer sentence of more than a year go to the BOP. And so as of November 2020, there were about 2,900 people spread between 122 different prisons all across the country. And there have been as many as 4,000 people incarcerated in the BOP in recent years.
Thank you, Casey. And she referenced the 1972 rebellion. This photo actually is a photo of people who led, some folks who led the 1972 rebellion at the old jail. There are more than 4,200 district residents like them who wake up every single day behind bars. And I think sometimes when we talk about building system reform and advocacy, it's very easy to gloss over or forget the fact that we're actually talking about people and people's lives. And so we just share this photo to help ground our conversation today in the people that who are impacted by our decisions.
And so, of course, the DC's criminal legal system's legacy isn't just racist. Our current system is also racist. So for some additional context, Black people make up 47% of DC's population, but 86% of the people we arrest, 92% of the people we jail, and 95% of the people in prison serving DC code sentences.
Yeah, and given I work, almost exclusively in the homeless services space, and you will not be surprised that number is exactly trended with who is actually experiencing homelessness in the district. 86% of people identify as Black or African American. So data, how many people are in the system? On any given day in 2017, 1 in every 22 adults in DC was justice or criminal legally involved, justice involved. DC's jail and parole and supervised release populations have been steadily declining for years following trends in the US. Our arrest and probation rates started climbing back up though in 2016. So the task force has a ton of data in its report, which is fantastic, on who is in our Department of Corrections, runs jails, and who's in the Federal Bureau of Prisons. What charges bring people to jail and prison, how Black people are detained longer pre-trial than white people, rates of mental illness and substance use disorders, analyses by race, by gender, by age. So for the sake of time today, though, we are really going to focus and show you on the very top level findings, but please, there's much more to dig into in the report.
So who is in our jails? So heading into the pandemic, there were about 1,800 people held in DOC custody on any given day. That population dipped as low as 1,200 over the summer, but is climbing back up. We're going to focus on 2018 numbers here, though, because that is the most recent year for which the task force had access to detailed data. So across both jails, the CDF and the CTF, 2,059 people were in DOC custody on any given day in 2018. We call this the average daily population, or ADP. There was a total of 9,986 people who were booked, which means they just walked through the doors, in DOC custody in 2018. 3/4 of the people resided in wards 5, 7, or 8, which are the most Black and poor wards in DC. The ADP was overwhelmingly male at 92% and overwhelmingly Black, also at 92%. We learned that people were held at DOC for one of 4 reasons. Either they were unsentenced and being detained pre-trial, they were sentenced and serving a misdemeanor sentence, or sometimes a short felony sentence post-conviction, a violation. So they were facing revocation of parole, probation, or supervision because of an alleged violation of release conditions, or they were there on a hold. So people held in DOC custody for another jurisdiction, mostly federal, but sometimes other states, or they were in transit to another facility.
So as a task force, it was really important to us to drill down and understand why are people being held in DC jails. So the top three booking, you can see here, the top three booking charge categories together account for over a third of all bookings in 2018. And that is violations that Casey was referencing, simple assaults, and drug offenses. And these are the top 10 charge categories. They account for 85% of DC bookings. So let me talk about violations category for a moment. This includes alleged violations of parole and supervised release, which generally falls into two categories. One is a technical violation, which is a violation of the rules of supervision, like failing a drug test or missing meetings with your supervision officer, or a new arrest violation where you've been arrested on a new charge. So keep in mind, this is only arrest and does not mean that you've been found guilty or even that charges will be pursued ultimately. We are way over incarcerating here. And this is one area where the task force is making a lot of policy recommendations to change when a person can be incarcerated for an alleged violation. And I'll tell you, I see this every day in our work in homeless services where people are booked for the violations constantly.
So then I mentioned this briefly earlier, but what happens to people who are at the jail and then sentenced to prison terms? So since 2001, when Lorton was closed, DC has sent all people sentenced to a year or more of incarceration to the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Data has been notoriously difficult to get from the BOP, but the task force did receive a one-day population snapshot this summer. There were 3,221 people in BOP custody serving sentences under DC law. Who's in BOP custody? As you can see from the figures here, these people are overwhelmingly Black and male.
So the Bureau of Prisons uses different charging categories than the Department of Corrections does, so we can't really make direct comparisons here. But half of the people at the Bureau of Prisons are serving homicide or aggravated assault sentences. A full 10% of people are serving violations of supervised release or parole with an average of 6-year terms. Drug sentences only account for 1% of the population, but they carry an 8-year average term. People are sentenced to an average of nearly 15 years for burglary or larceny charges and nearly 13 years on robbery. Combined, these account for 18% of the Bureau of Prisons population.
Now we're going to shift gears a little bit from population data and talk about what we learned from our neighbors. So throughout phase 1 and 2, the task force ran focus groups, community visioning workshops, and surveys, both online and in person, that touched 2,500 DC residents, about 500 of whom were incarcerated at either the DOC or BOP facilities when we connected with them. The task force learned an incredible amount from what community members think about safety and harm in their neighborhoods, about the failures of our current jails and justice system, and about their vision for DC's future.
So community safety, let's talk about that first. In phase 1 community survey, we asked people to say how much they agree with the statement, crime is a big problem in my neighborhood. As you can see, the people who feel the least safe are those who've been incarcerated and who identify as victims of crime. Then we also ask people to rate the statement, incarceration is the best way to handle people who get arrested. 70% of every subgroup analyzed disagreed, 70%.
So in phase 2, like I said, we were also able to ask people who are currently incarcerated in BOP prisons about whether they supported building a new prison in DC and where they would prefer to serve their own sentences. 71% of respondents want a DC prison and 62% would prefer to serve their sentence there. In our broader DC resident survey, less than 6% of respondents think our current jail meets our needs. So while people have different ideas about solutions, nearly everybody agrees that our current facilities aren't working.
So then the task force, we took all that we learned from the jail and prison data and from studying other jurisdictions, and from DC residents' concerns in the visioning, and developed a 10-year plan for transforming the DC jails and legal justice system. The implementation plan is divided into 3 stages that you see here with some details. Stage 1 are the policy changes. Divest. We need to reinvest, decarcerate, local control of prisons and incarceration, and design a new facility. This is where our biggest focus is right now. These steps will be taken over the next 5 years to reduce our incarcerated population before we actually begin building a new facility. The second stage is construct the first part of the new facility, operate it as an annex to CTF, and then demolish CDF for the current facility. With reduced incarceration levels, then we can begin transferring people from home, from the Bureau of Prisons and other places. The third stage is complete the new facility construction, demolish CTF, and end the use of the Bureau of Prisons. The report presents an 80-point implementation plan organized by system intercept from community investments to prevent law enforcement contact, policing, charging, pretrial release, case processing, disposition and sentencing, facilities, release from incarceration, probation, parole, and supervised release, and finally reentry. It is incredibly comprehensive.
You've heard Christy and I talk a lot about these implementation plans. So here is an example of one of the 80 pieces of the implementation plan. As you can see, the top line recommendation is followed by an analysis of the type and size of the outcome of the recommended change, including the impact on racial disparities and other special populations, how we can measure the success of the recommendations implementation, who needs to do what, when to make the change, and the estimated savings or cost of that change. The task force didn't have all of the information for every recommendation, but filled in data where it could and will continue working to fill in the blanks. So please reach out if you have any questions about something that isn't here. The committee reports also contain more detail and the citations for this information, and those will also be a great resource for you.
So you all are an incredibly civically active group. And so this comes, I think speaks right to you. We are right in budget season. So we are getting close to the mayor's budget recommendations, et cetera. So let's start there with the budget. Many of the task force recommendations really involve divesting from the traditional criminal legal system functions like policing and incarceration, and then reinvesting those funds in evidence-based programs that build community safety. Other recommendations move work that police have been doing for years to non-law enforcement agencies like the Department of Behavioral Health, for example. We know that the pandemic will make this a difficult budget year, but these are all actions that the DC Council can take by simply just moving funding from one agency to another rather than creating new funds. So for example, the task force recommends that we reduce MPD's budget by up to $140 million a year over 5 years, by terminating the school safety contract, spending less on crowd control supplies and military style equipment, and then reducing its patrol force by 25%. The reduction in patrol force, and I think this is where it's often confusing, people don't quite understand, can be done solely through just the attrition, that's turnover. So since FY14, between 4 and 10% of the force sworn services, the sworn force has left MPD every single year. So that turnover piece. And we don't want to just reduce staffing and spending at MPD, but we also want to reduce the responsibilities and workload. And we can do this by, for example, moving civil traffic enforcement from MPD over to the Department of Transportation. Another is moving certain emergency responses away from MPD and moving our 911 and 311 systems so that the Department of Behavioral Health Community Response Team can respond to crises in which a person is likely to want or need treatment intervention instead of police or in conjunction with police. And this is actively actually happening right now. It's very exciting.
It is very exciting. The district will also see savings from reducing its jail population. The task force makes many recommendations that will lead to fewer people incarcerated at the jail and specifically reduce the over-policing and over-incarceration of Black people. Some of the recommendations that the task force makes include maintaining the COVID-19 responsive changes to the Metropolitan Police Department's citation release and field arrest orders, limiting stop and frisk, raising the age of juvenile jurisdiction to 21 and eliminating the waiver of youth into adult court, eliminating all presumptions of pretrial detention and requiring judges to make individual determinations in each case, setting maximum probation and supervised release periods at 2 years, and prohibiting revocations of probation and supervised release for most first technical violations. There's also a lot more, and in the report, there is a lot of detail about how to get all of this accomplished.
The task force really, and this is where I spent most of my time in the task force, was making specific recommendations about where to reinvest, because the divesting doesn't come without reinvesting funding from the policing and the jail budgets, and base it on the priority areas identified through the community engagement. So again, this was not just the task force making these recommendations, it was based on listening to the community. So at the top of the list are these things: the housing, behavioral health care, transformative justice approaches to safety and accountability in schools, expanding the use of violence interrupters, if you're familiar with that concept, expanding peer support and mentoring opportunities for returning citizens at community-based organizations. So, and then in phase 2, we also had the opportunity to survey people serving DC sentences in the Bureau of Prisons specifically about their reentry back into the community. Those survey respondents' top 3 concerns about reentry were getting healthcare, finding a job, and getting community trust and support. Over 70% of respondents indicated worry about those issues. Nearly half of all those who will be released within 5 years are worried about getting mental health treatment, and 1/3 are worried about getting substance use treatment.
Other recommendations aimed at reducing the number of people we send to prison and reducing the length of time people stay in prison include repealing all mandatory minimums, amending DC's Second Look Act to allow people who have served at least 10 years to petition the court for resentencing, which I believe, and Christy can correct me if I'm wrong, recently happened. Yep, I'm seeing a nod. So that one we can check there. Expanding eligibility for good time and educational credits and compassionate release, expanding work release and home confinement, and beginning operations of DC's Clemency Board. The goal is to reduce DC's incarcerated population by 1/3 to 1/2 within the next 10 years. CCE ran projections based on our DOC and BOP data and the task force's community investments, decarceration, and local control recommendations, and this is absolutely a feasible goal.
And then instead of just focusing, the theme on just reimagining a jail, the task force looked at the whole criminal legal system. And that way we were able to think very differently about DC's detention facility needs as well as part of that. So reducing the combined jail and prison populations by 2,000 or 3,000 people would mean that DC can build a new non-traditional facility that houses both people who are pretrial and those who are serving sentences, both. So for the first time in 30 years, we can stop using the Bureau of Prisons, which again means moving people across the country, and bring people home to DC and have say over the environmental and programming available to them. DC will demolish its 2 jails in stages and the end of the use of the Bureau of Prisons' 122 prisons, so that by 2030, we have a single facility for everybody who's actually left in that system.
So how can you help? As you all are keenly aware, in order to change our budgets and laws and policies, we need our elected leadership to hear loud and clear from voters that they want to transform DC's jails and justice system. We have a couple of ideas about how you can help. You can show your communities how and where to use their voices on the issues that you and your neighbors care most about. We would also love to see groups like yours showing up to testify or advocating for some of these more urgent policy changes. Specifically, we would love to hear, we would love to have your help and your partnership in advocating for the implementation plan. 3 recommendations in particular we're starting with this year. So the first one would be testifying at the MPD, DBH, and DDOT budget hearings, asking the Judiciary Committee to mark up criminal record sealing bills before the end of May, which is rapidly approaching, and weighing in on what parole should look like when DC gets local control back next year. That being said, we would love to spend the rest of the time today to not only answer questions, but also hear about, your thoughts and visions for what the future of DC's jails and justice system should look like, and brainstorm next steps we can take to act on the task force's recommendations. Second, we are doing these briefings all around DC. If you know another organization, your ANC, your place of worship, your virtual game night friends that could benefit from learning about this work, please put us in touch. And then if you do want to keep updated more generally, you can sign up for CCE's newsletter on our website at www.courtexcellence.org. Shameless plug, I make our newsletters, so it would be really nice if you signed up. We would also love to hear from you about what is and isn't working in your neighborhood. We have the contact information and the links to the reports on the last slide, and we will email this slide deck out after the presentation. But for now, Christine, I would love to hear your questions and your ideas.
A lot of data, a lot to take in. I think folks, we're a small group, could just unmute themselves and jump in. I can't see all pages at once.
So Sharon was going to be our Sharon Anderson was going to be our moderator of this part, but I want to say first, thank you very much. It was really informative, and we definitely have our work cut out for us, ladies. I think we're all ladies right now. So Sharon, you want to take over here?
Yes, thank you, Catherine. Yes, indeed. Thank you all very much. This is a lot of information. You have obviously done a great deal of amount of work, and we salute you for this and your commitment and producing such a thorough report. I've put your contact information in the chat. Let me make sure I have actually posted that. There we go. So that everyone has your email addresses or your websites in order to get more details. One of the questions that has just popped up is a question of, and Casey just posted the task force report, the link to that. That's one of the questions asked was about the $88,105 per year per person and how that compares with other states. Chris, if you want to unmute yourself, if you want to elaborate on your question.
It looks like that's what we spend per person per year to keep them in prison. I don't know if that probably covers court fees and things like that. I'm not sure. But I'm just curious where that stands with other states.
Casey, I don't actually know. I can do a little digging while we're here. I know we have that comparison somewhere, but that's a great question. Do you know, Casey, or?
I do not know off the top of my head. I do believe there are some pretty, because since this, the task force's report was pretty DC specific and looked at other jurisdictions insofar as, for example, in community investments, when we were talking about diverting behavioral health 911 calls away from the police and having the DBH's community response team respond instead, we looked at Oregon's Cahoots model, which is sort of doing that and leading the way there. So we looked at other jurisdictions insofar as to see what they were doing right and what we could try to model things after. But we didn't necessarily do any comparisons there. But so what I can do is we can see what we can find. And when I send the slide deck to Catherine, I can try to include some information about that answer for you as well.
Yeah,
I
will add, oh, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah. And I didn't know what all it included, whether that's just the facility, the cost it takes to actually just put people up in the jail, or whether it includes lots of other, obviously, probably personnel and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I believe it's all of it. So it's everything it takes to keep someone incarcerated. So the meals, the staff, et cetera. Just for comparison, that just so you understand too, like a little comparison, not by state, but in the district, for, people with serious mental illness, and you saw that statistic around that people who are returning citizens themselves are interested in getting behavioral health, mental health treatment coming out. But our prisons and our jails are filled with people with serious mental health challenges. To provide permanent housing and very intensive wraparound support services for people with the most serious mental illness, like what Pathways does, including people who've been formerly incarcerated, it's less than $30,000 a year. That's for the housing and the services. And we provide the highest level of care. The next step is St. E's, which is about $1,000 a day. So it just gives you a little bit of comparison around, it's much more expensive to keep people incarcerated than in housing with wraparound support services.
Wow. Thank you.
Okay. One of the questions, of course, we've been talking a lot relative to statehood for the District of Columbia and wanting to know how this works within transitioning to us becoming a state. How would that work?
Absolutely. So there were 4 committees for the task force, and one was the Committee on Local Control, and they were really sort of tasked with thinking very critically about these things, and they made several local control recommendations. The biggest, most pressing one right now is local control of parole. So some of these facets of DC's criminal legal system, DC is slowly sort of acquiring back, like local control. Were DC to become a state, it would just have to wholesale acquire them back. And so there are some very big decisions that need to be made. So local control of parole, right now, anyone who is petitioning for parole goes before the United States Parole Commission. And they do not have a very good reputation among folks who go before them or work with them. And DC right now is having conversations about what a new paroling authority would look like in the district. The United States Parole Commission is set to sunset or cease operations on November 1st, 2022. So we are rapidly running up on time. We also are establishing a clemency board, which has had several meetings, but I don't believe has begun accepting applications yet. But certain things that are currently, federally contracted out, DC would assume control over those, or even, DC Superior Court is federally funded. Judges are appointed by Congress. They are confirmed by Congress. DC sends them a list of judges that they would like to see confirmed, but ultimately Congress gets to make those decisions. And so DC would assume control of DC Superior Court, both in terms of judicial appointments, but also in funding DC Superior Court. I can drop the link to the Committee on Local Controls report for you guys in the chat. Christy, I don't know if you have anything else you'd like to add.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Thanks, Casey.
Great. Yes, please do drop that link. That'll be very helpful. Another question that popped up in the chat has to do with the implementation of Restore the Vote. The experiences that were had last November in trying to reach, especially, reach those citizens who were in the Bureau of Prisons and trying to get them information. So the challenges of, as far as the election, working with the Board of Elections, getting those who were within the Board of Prisons, and also sunsetting CSOSA. Kathy, did I do your question justice, or do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, it's challenging. So I'm curious if you can skip ahead to the recommendations for moving forward with this.
In Casey, I'm going to defer to you, since I really was focused mostly on the community side of things.
No, you are totally fine. The Restore the Vote Amendment Act was very exciting because DC joins Maine and Vermont as being the only 3 jurisdictions that do not disenfranchise someone. The task force's report, I do not believe, went into meaningful detail about how to implement the Restore the Vote Amendment Act, unfortunately. Obviously it is sort of in line with much of the task force's thinking, restoring the right to vote, helping folks, more meaningfully and better transition back into the community and, become full-fledged community members. But the task force was not involved in sort of how we implement that, though it is certainly frustrating when folks are de facto disenfranchised because their absentee ballots don't make it to them. The task force made several recommendations that relate to supervision, but largely they were sort of around, technical violations and, whether or not somebody should be detained for their first technical violation, around terms of supervised release, setting a maximum of 2 years, that sort of a thing. But the task force did not explicitly make a recommendation on how to sunset CSOSA.
Hi, this is Yolene. I thought it'd be easier if I verbally ask, and thank you, Christy and Casey, for the really interesting and insightful presentation. There was a slide that you showed with the breakdown of the arrests that were made and the reasons why people are now in jail. And I was just curious if there's more capture of the qualitative data, if it was a burglary, but it was related to a criminal act of survival. Is there a way to distill that information? And then this is prior to getting the arrest, but is there a policy reform for how to approach these criminal acts of survival so that people don't end up in jail?
Those are both really great questions. We have a DOC data analysis. I was looking for it on our website that I think
that's what I'm looking for too. Yeah.
It goes into a bit more detail.
Data. Yeah, you keep looking.
That goes into a bit more detail than what is on this slide. I was not the person who did the data analysis. We would not have gotten as good of an analysis if I was in charge of it. I'm not sure if they break it down that specifically or if they just sort of do it by top charge and don't give an explanation. My best guess, quite frankly, just given how difficult it is to get data and sort of how vague some of it can be, which I think is probably by design, it likely does not give that sort of breakdown in terms of if it was sort of out of survival. I do not believe the task force makes a specific question, not a specific question, a specific recommendation regarding not decriminalizing those offenses, but the task force does sort of include language on decriminalizing certain offenses and also having judges have a bit more discretion over decision-making and repealing all mandatory minimums. So I think some of those recommendations probably dovetail a little bit into what you're asking, though I do not believe that there is a specific recommendation that calls that out explicitly.
Yeah, and I think where there's a lot of overlap too around the behavioral health side of things, and a lot of people experiencing homelessness and who are using substances, this is the number one entryway into the legal system is either crimes of survival or very low level drug uses, like purchasing with intent to use for themselves, not to sell to others or to deal. And I think I'm really excited about the pilot work that's happening at the Department of Behavioral Health around the diversion calls and for behavioral health emergencies, 311, et cetera. And it doesn't exactly get to what you're talking about, but I think there's a connection there for survival crimes where people can be diverted in other ways. And so I'm really excited to how to operationalize some of these things as well on the behavioral health side. It's at least a good start. So instead of the 7-Eleven owner calling the 911 and the police coming because someone is aggressively panhandling and stole some food, for example, sending out the Department of Behavioral Health team is the response team, and that's being piloted right now.
Oh, that's good to hear. Thank you.
Christy, I know you mentioned that your work on the task force, you were involved a lot on the sort of the community side, and certainly your organization dealing with issues of housing. Are there some high-level points you want to flag for our attention related to that?
So yeah, I think a couple of things. I love that question. The slide there around what people themselves were asking for is the most critical, because we could all sit around that task force and have conversations about what we thought people needed and what we think people wanted, but actually asking people who are returning or who had experience with the criminal legal systems themselves has been the most important part of this. So universal themes, though, are not surprising, are they? They're just basic needs: housing, employment, mental health services. I was actually, even though I've been doing this work about 25 years in homeless services and this huge overlap, by the number of people who actually said that was one of their top 3 concerns, was receiving the treatment they needed once they got back into the community. That number was even greater than I thought it would be, which again is so telling that people, we all want some universal things: to feel loved, to feel part of community, to have safe, decent, affordable housing. These are universal things. It looks different for every person. But the barriers that exist for people who are returning into community, we just know are overwhelming. So those pieces around those basic human needs, I think that's the top level report, and that's the top level in terms of our voting decisions, how we choose to use our vote. And then I think another one, and this is where it very overlaps with the work that you all do here, is engaging people themselves in this process to change the system. And making sure people have the access to vote and understand their rights to vote. So I will tell you, in a recent voter registration campaign last year on the street, we did a very large campaign to register folks to vote experiencing homelessness. The number of people who were returning citizens who thought that they were not allowed to vote, given their previous criminal legal history, is not surprising to you all. They thought they couldn't vote. So all that education there and involving people in these decisions. So those were my big takeaways. Not surprised that people need basic human needs, and reaffirming all those, like, go back to the people, ask the people what they want. And that's actually the basis of everything we do at Pathways. Listen to the people. They'll tell us their needs.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Another question in the chat had to do with about statehood, and therefore, I think part of this was the discussion about the fact that Congress makes judicial appointments for us. Am I on the right track? Kathy, I'm just going to ask you to unmute and elaborate on your question.
So I just want to, excuse me, a follow up on the point of CSOSA. Making sure that I'm right in thinking that upon statehood, we would take over all the functions currently performed by CSOSA. And therefore, we wouldn't be reliant on their federally appointed leadership to shape the resources and the process for reentry, supervision, and beyond that. So I just want to make a point that, our own, just confirming that my understanding is right, that we DC would have not just more input, but control over all of that, responsibility for that.
Yes, yeah, that is my understanding as well, is that DC would then assume those functions and would be able to have control over, the rules, guidelines, and standards, which is very similar to sort of the notion of bringing folks home from the BOP, because if they are home from the BOP and they're in a DC run facility, we have control over the amount and quality of programming, the healthcare they receive, the educational opportunities that they have. We would have control over those things as well.
Yeah.
So I have a question about, because when I talk about statehood, there's a lot of times that people come, yeah, but you don't even have a prison in DC, and where are you going to put it? And not in my backyard, and what I'm learning from you all today, because this has not been my focus, and I would love to be able to get a coherent sense of here's what we're doing about this. So no worries, folks, there's a transition period in the statehood bill. So obviously we would use that transition period. But right now, what I'm hearing is that there are all kinds of things that we can do right now moving forward. And I saw that slide where you had stages, but I lost track. What's first? You know, where's your first thing? And so that I could just say in my statehood, you know, spiel, yes, of course, we're already doing, you know, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. So can you give me that language for my current presentation?
Absolutely. So for us to get to the spot that the task force wants us to get to, which is having this one non-traditional facility that will house everybody, we have to reduce the incarcerated population by 1/2 to 1/3. So the things we can do now all relate to how can we reduce that incarcerated population? What are the, you know, budget changes, legislative changes, policy changes that need to happen in order for us to get that population lowered? So testifying at the MPD, DBH, and DDOT budget hearings is a good first step. MPD would be around the task force's recommendations of, you know, reducing their patrol force, certain changes to arrests and citations, that sort of a thing. So less people are coming into contact with MPD and therefore the justice system. DBH would be around expanding, having the community response team, CRT, show up for mental health related emergency calls, which Christy mentioned, there's a pilot happening right now for that, but so it would be supporting those efforts. And then DDOT would be having civil traffic violations moved from MPD to DDOT and having them handle that instead. So again, trying to reduce the points of contact for people with the criminal justice system. We also would like to have Judiciary Committee mark up the criminal record sealing bills by the end of May. Ideally, these changes would allow more folks to have their records sealed and therefore, you know, hopefully give them a better opportunity of, you know, really going out there and, you know, partaking in the community and finding, you know, meaningful employment and success and opportunities that they might not have otherwise, which can help them not become justice involved. We can also start thinking about what parole should look like. Right now, the United States Parole Commission, folks are really unhappy and, you know, people aren't being granted parole, or, you know, they're having their parole revoked and the task force has recommendations around, you know, revocation. But if we can get a paroling authority in DC that really performs its duties, both in a way that, you know, honors the growth and the changes of the person before them, but also community safety and, you know, victim impact if there was a victim, if we can find a parole board or create a parole board that does those things, more people might be released out on parole, which then reduces that number further and further shrinks those things. So those are really the 3 places to start, and just advocating for continued decarceration measures, because if we can shrink that population, then we can build that non-traditional facility and then we can bring people home.
Okay, thank you. Let me just say that if I said it the way you're saying it, and I couldn't agree with you more, but just for the record, if I said it the way you're saying it, the people who are against DC statehood would be saying, oh, so you're just going to let all the criminals go, right? You know, and then they'll be running around. Oh, good. That's another reason not to have statehood. So, you know, I'm not asking you to fix that, but, you know, that's one of the things that I always have to think about is what my audience going to say. So.
And can I just leap in though and just say, and I know it's not perfect, and obviously for some people who are bound and determined to oppose statehood, they're going to oppose it anyway. But I thought one of the great takeaways for me from this discussion was the fact that we are working on it and there are some things in motion now. And even though that's not going to satisfy that audience, I think the point that a lot of people are trying to do is sort of that ambush, and to be able to say, we're working on this. We have citizen task forces that have been involved, because I know the court the Council for Court Excellence was also involved with the police reform. I mean, we are dealing with this. I think folks want to imply that we don't know what we're doing. So for what it's worth, Anne, give it a shot.
Thank you.
I want to be mindful of our time. There was one last question before we close out about the task force being able to visit with folks who were incarcerated. Was that part of the work that you did? Anne, does that capture your question? I want to make sure I'm covering what you wanted covered.
Yes, I think it's been difficult to visit people at the DC jail without being a member of one's family. So I just wondered if anybody if the task force or anyone had visited individuals at the DC jail as part of this study.
So the task force was able to go to the DC jail prior to COVID. I believe it probably happened in phase 1 of the task force's work. Some members did go to the DC jail. Additionally, several task force members are direct service providers, and they have been able to still go in and visit their clients during this time, though not explicitly about the task force's work, but so people are still in and around, and they did do that visit. The task force did have a returning citizen representative, Tyrone Hall. So he served as a member of the task force and provided a very unique and wonderful perspective, and has actually done a few of these presentations with us, which is really great. And since, like you said, it has been very difficult to get into the facility to see people, unless you're family, we were able to conduct surveys. And so that was one way to try to get feedback and to hear from folks who were incarcerated and try to, work around the fact that we physically could not get in there, aside from the visit that the task force did.
Hey, thank you very, very much. As we close out, and before I turn it over to Kathy, again, I just want to join the chorus of saying thank you for this very helpful report and discussion with us. I wanted to also make a plug, Casey, for your newsletter. I'm assuming that is the best way for us to keep up to date on what's going on. Do you want to just, as I exit, if you'll just repeat how to get that?
Yeah, so you can sign up for CCE's newsletter by visiting our website, which is www.courtexcellence.org. Thank
you. And I now turn it over to Kathy, our president.
Well, thank you. Thank you to our presenters and the attendees. This was fantastic. And this was also our first sort of lunchtime scheduled event. So it's neat that it worked. So thank you for joining us in that experiment. I want to really thank you for all this good, solid information and resource to help us do our work. And I want to remind everybody to something that you've hinted at all along, and that is how important local elections are. We all got really wrapped up in the national election this past cycle, but we know here in DC, so much of our day in, day out lives are shaped by decisions made by our DC council. So local elections do really matter. And Nonprofit Vote is hosting a webinar tomorrow at 2 o'clock on this very topic. So if anybody needs a link, just email me or reach out to me. And also a plug to join our voter services team. Hopefully, as more and more opportunities come up for us to feel safe and comfortable being out in the community, we'll get back to doing our voter registration work, reaching out to the shelters again, which we were doing before the pandemic, working with CSOSA and other agencies and groups working with our returning citizens to make sure to dispel that very notion that too many think they are not entitled to vote. And of course, continue working on our implementation of Restore the Vote and figuring out how best to reach the people in the Bureau of Prisons. There's lots of privacy issues on where they are and who they are, and we're trying to figure out how to negotiate that. So any and all help is very welcome. And of course, all of this is up for change as we work to achieve full rights and statehood. And that and statehood team is up and running at an incredible pace. New members are always welcome for that team as we do presentations around the country on Zoom, of course, but working with a lot of community groups. So it all ties together. So participation is key. And thank you again, the CCE team, for participating today. This was terrific. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Can I just jump in and just again thank Catherine Ray for helping to organize and pull this together. This is so helpful and really, really appreciate it. So thank you, Catherine.
All right, take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Stay safe.
Thank you again. Bye, everybody.
All right, bye. Thank you, Anne. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
What would you like me to do with the recording?
You want to stop the recording now?
Oh, yeah, that's a great idea.